And so we were driving through the state of Maine, which is mostly forest. And I was in the passenger side on the back seat on the right side. So I'm watching the road as it goes by. And I think I see a bird sitting on the railing of the highway, really far away in the distance. And it's coming towards us, and the bird is getting bigger and bigger. And I realized this is a huge bird. We passed the bird, and it's, I'm guessing, 6 feet, maybe, while sitting, a gigantic bird who watched me as we went by. I was kind of watching him, and he was watching me, and he turned his head as we went by. So I asked my brother sitting next to me, my parents were in the front, "Did you see that?" None of them did. So as it turns out, the place that we were driving through was part of an Indian reservation where the Thunderbird was part of the lore.
Welcome back. I am here with Dr. Dean Radin. Dean, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I think we've been going back and forth for about a year now or something like that. I've been trying to get you on for a while because I think you're one of several, but not many, folks who have been really digging in on this subject and kind of covering it and doing rigorous empirical analysis on psi phenomena and any other phenomena that's related to what people would call the paranormal or supernormal. So there's a recent book that you put out called Real Magic, where you posit that a lot of this phenomena can be subdivided into 3 different areas. So before we get to that, if you could just let the audience know quickly about your bio, background, and then we'll get started.
So my education is an undergraduate in electrical engineering with a minor in physics. Ended up with honors in physics. And then a master's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And then it's going to sound like a major switch, but it's really not. I got my doctorate in psychology because I was interested in cybernetics and artificial intelligence in electrical engineering. And at the time, there were 2 different directions you could go. You could go into a hardware direction and stay in electrical engineering and build better computers. Like my advisor at the time was the principal in a company called Thinking Machines, which is one of the first massively parallel computing systems that were created for things like deep learning and artificial intelligence. So the other direction you could go was on the software side, cognitive modeling and neural networks and things like that. So on the campus at the time, I had 2 choices I could go. I could go in the hardware direction or the software. I decided to go into the software direction. So my doctorate is in psychology, but what I was actually working on was the equivalent today of artificial intelligence.
And for context, this is the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, right? This is the same place that Mark Andreessen went, who was the founder of Netscape and, Andreessen Horowitz venture capital firm, all that good stuff. So it's well known for those subjects. In
terms of its engineering school, it's typically rated among the top 10 in the US, sometimes the top 5. So yeah, it's a good school. And even within the psychology department, again, it's one of the top rated schools.
Okay. So I wanted the audience to know that because I know you're going to be humble and not say those sorts of things. I know that, but
yeah. So let me continue, because with a background in electrical engineering and then in psychology, I've actually not worked very much in either of those 2 areas. This often happens. You get a degree and you go off and do something else.
You and me both, by the way.
Yeah, that's pretty common. So the other fields that I've worked in and published in is neuroscience, psychophysiology, physics, computer science, more recently, and genetics and genetic medicine. And all of that sort of like conventional areas. And then underneath all of that, continuously, pretty much since graduate school, I've been studying psychic and mystical experiences, and in the last 4 or 5 years, magical experiences.
Okay, so let's talk about magical experiences. Now, I think in your book, Real Magic, you posit that there's kind of 3 different categories. Can you kind of go through those so that we can ground the audience in the topic.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
The category that most people think of as being magical, Harry Potter-ish, is enchantment. So it involves the idea that mind and matter interact, or that you can, through the force of your will, shape destiny. That's one way of thinking of it. The second category is divination, typically perceiving through time, but it's also perceiving through space. And after Einstein, space and time are more or less the same, or at least aspects of each other. So divination involves perception through space and time. And then the third category is called theurgy, which comes out of Latin terms, roughly meaning divine work, God work, something like that. And it refers to the evocation or invocation of spirits, non-human entities of any kind. So there's a long tradition. Magic is sort of wrapped up in all of these three different categories of experiences. Some people specialize in one area or another. But if you'll just look at books that are popular, many of the books are about enchantment. That's what a book of spells is about, a grimoire. It typically is about shaping destiny or influencing things out there, typically for power, for sex, and for other things that people want. That's traditionally what it's used for.
Okay, let's start with, let's say, divination. What are some examples of what would fit in there? Are we talking remote viewing, tarot cards? Like, what are some of the things that people might recognize that would fit in that category?
The stereotype is the fortune teller gazing into a crystal ball, and many variations thereof, and reading the tea leaves, and lots of and throwing the runes and astrology, and on and on. Any method which involves getting a perception or a vision of something happening elsewhere, either in space or time. So that's I'll contrast that against enchantment because it's passive. It's a matter of perceiving something, not necessarily a matter of influencing it.
Okay, let's talk about enchantment. What sorts of things? You talked about spells a little bit. Would remote influencing, let's say, I imagine that would be kind of in the enchantment category. What else would be in there?
Yeah, enchantment is any kind of mind-matter interaction. So you can think of it sometimes as manifestation, as a sort of enchantment. Law of attraction is sort of in that area. There are lots of different terms, and they're all shaped by culture and time, history. They all devolve down, though, into the assumption that mind and matter can directly interact. However, and throughout history, there's dozens and dozens of methods that have been used, but that's the essence of it. And by the way, for divination or enchantment and theurgy, the reason why I got interested in all of this is because for decades I've been studying psychic phenomena in the laboratory. And at one point, I suddenly realized one day that the phenomena that we study in the laboratory that have different names, like remote viewing, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, and so on, those are exactly the same as what traditionally is called magical from a different tradition. So enchantment in the laboratory is psychokinetic effects. Sometimes in a popular sense, people say it's telekinetic, but telekinetic is an older term that was primarily used to describe movement of large objects during seances. So we'd love to see that in the laboratory, but we never do. So we don't use that term anymore, at least those of us who are doing this sort of stuff. We use psychokinesis because the targets that we're aiming the mind at are typically microscopic. Not always, but targets that where the assumption of the interaction between mind and matter is very, very small, to a small magnitude effect, as opposed to like seeing something levitate, which presumably would require a lot of force. As I said, we would love to be able to see somebody levitate in the laboratory, but as best as we can tell, nobody can do it for real.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
That doesn't mean it isn't real, just means that we can't see it. We don't see it.
Okay. Now, theurgy, what sort of examples would you put there or place there?
So theurgy, within a parapsychological perspective, would be considered evidence for survival of consciousness after bodily death. That's it, the whole domain of survival research, because it has the assumption that when the body and the brain dies, that something persists in some form. It also assumes that while some of those departed entities may have once been human, there could be many other kinds of entities that may never have been human. So in the modern era, it would include even things like ETs, some non-human intelligence, which doesn't quite seem to be physical in the way that we consider our bodies to be physical. So any other form of intelligence or consciousness that is not a living human being, as we currently understand all of those words. So you might have an entity which would fit into theurgy, which is living. Like in, with folklore, you have a vampire. Well, it's not human. It's a thing. That could potentially be something that would fall into that category. But usually it's about mostly invisible or completely invisible non-human entities.
Okay. Now that we have those definitions set out, what does the empirical data show? Are any of those kind of three things, have you been able to rule any of them out? Which of the three things seems to have the strongest effects, and anything else that you think might be worth mentioning?
For some kinds of divination, the evidence is extremely strong. And by that, I mean that when in science, what we mean by evidence is typically the kind of evidence that we can gain confidence in is a controlled experiment, which is set up in advance and tightly controlled in the sense that when something happens, we know it wasn't a mistake, and we know it wasn't fraud and all those things. And that can be independently replicated and replicated many, many times from different laboratories. And then you take the results of all of that. Typically, it takes decades to get lots of replications. And then you do a meta-analysis, which is an analysis of analyses. Each study has an analysis. You put them together into a meta-analysis, and you can reach certain conclusions. You can say, is this effect actually repeatable or not? Mm-hmm. And if it's not repeatable, it might still be true, but it doesn't have the same currency in science because you want something to be independently that people can do something in the laboratory and get similar or same results. That's what gives us confidence that something exists. And also that whatever the thing is that's being repeated, it's not due to chance. So there's two things. Well, first of all, you establish an effect size. How big is the thing that we're seeing? Mm-hmm. And it's not zero, and it's not chance, and it's seen by lots of people. So when you take that as a criterion for what we would consider to be so close to established that it might as well be established, telepathy for sure. Telepathy because there's at least 3 different classes of experiments looking at mind-to-mind connections, some involving conscious reports, some involving physiological responses, and they show consistency across different experiments for many, many decades. So we have very high confidence that something like mind-to-mind connections exist. for remote viewing, otherwise known as clairvoyance, the ability to gain information from a distance in space, very high confidence that that exists. For precognition, which is clairvoyance, but through time, very high confidence, again, from several different classes of experiments. When taken together, the preponderance of all of that says we still don't have a very good explanation as to why any of this stuff exists. There are theories, but not theories that everybody accepts yet. But from just a purely empirical point of view, we have very high confidence that clairvoyance exists. So this is all so far on the perceptual side. So if we move over to the mind-matter interaction or enchantment side, there's a large body of experiments involving random events, random physical events, like tossing of dice and the use of electronic random number generators, with hundreds of experiments repeated over, again, many decades by many different laboratories. And the results there also suggest that we have high confidence that something like mind-matter interaction exists. It's a little tricky, though, in trying to understand exactly what is happening in a mind-matter interaction study, because it's somewhat confounded with clairvoyance. And what I mean is that you run a study and you have some kind of physical system that you're trying to mentally interact with. And one explanation then is that there is a causal connection. The mind wants to do something, and sure enough, you see it. And under controlled conditions where nobody's trying to do anything, it's acting like chance, or it's acting according to a baseline. But then the counter to that is, why did you select this particular target at this particular time with this particular set of people to do this particular task? Well, that's how we set up an experiment. But a person who accepts the evidence, like something really did happen, could say, well, there are different interpretations of that. We agree it's not chance. Something looks like mind-matter interaction, but is it a correlation? Well, if it is, that doesn't necessarily mean it's causal. So it doesn't mean that there are force beams coming out of your head. It means that there's some relationship that has been set up. And so how do we understand the relationship? Could be that the mind actually does do something, which we could metaphorically at least think of as force beams coming out of your head. Or it could be that when somebody sets up an experiment, that they intuitively are setting it up in just the right way, so a synchronicity will occur. Mm-hmm. And so from this perspective, every experiment that's done in this domain, in psychic domain, is kind of a created synchronicity. It's almost like an oxymoron. Synchronicity is a coincidence that happens to be meaningful. A psi experiment is a coincidence that we set up in advance, and it's meaningful, at least to the experimenters, and it works. So this is what I'm trying to convey here, is that there's subtleties in trying to understand how these effects work. And so, as I said, there are theories, physical theories out there suggesting that this is not violating anything that we know about the physical world, but we still don't know the major connection, which is, what is the nature of consciousness? And I'll include in that mind, not brain stuff, but mind stuff. How is that connected to the rest of the physical world? Mm-hmm. So we can take all this whole domain, including theurgy, and sort of encapsulate the whole thing into the question of, what is the role of consciousness in the physical world? That's really what it's about. And so from a scientific perspective, for many, many years, changing now somewhat, for many years, the answer was there is no connection. There's no direct connection between consciousness and the physical world. But the reason that is said is because it has been assumed for at least 100 or 200 years that your sense of awareness, your experiential subjective sense, is something that the brain produces. It's a matter of activity in the brain, electrochemical activity, that somehow gives rise to internal experience. And that is still the prevailing theory in most of science today. But all of the phenomena that we're just discussing now challenge that assumption, saying, well, if it really is the brain that gives rise to your experience, then how could I have a mind-to-mind connection with somebody else? The only plausible way of doing that is that electromagnetic signals from my brain somehow waft their way to somebody else, and they can decode it. But we know that that's not true because many experiments have shown that it's not electromagnetic. So what's causing the correlation? Well, we don't know. And I would give the same response for all of the other phenomena. At fundamental levels, we don't know yet how these kinds of connections are made. But from an empirical perspective, we have high confidence that they exist.
Now, what about theurgy in terms of some of the experiments?
Well, theurgy, if you consider categories of evidence like reincarnation would suggest that there's some element of yourself that persists from one life to another. Near-death experience suggests that something separates from the body and can perceive as though there's clairvoyance or something like that, and interact with other entities out there. And you can go through roughly 8 or 10 different categories of evidence like this, all suggesting that there's some kind of survival, many times overlapping or interacting with the idea that there are independent entities out there. So how do we understand that? Well, that also is strongly confounded with psi in the living. Because when you think about it, all of the evidence, 100% of the evidence for survival comes from living people.
Mm-hmm.
It's experiences or things that people report from the living about what they presume is dead. So it's a confound. This is a great example of when you're dealing with the edge of the known, sometimes you don't know yet how to explain things or even whether some things exist in the way that you think of. So we can say from the body of evidence, there's a lot of evidence for something like survival, and some of it is really compelling. There are many interpretations. So this shouldn't bother us too much because after all, quantum mechanics is the best physical theory we've ever had, and there's at least a dozen interpretations of that. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of things out there that we can say we have high confidence that this works, and quantum mechanics accounts for something like 1/3 of the world's economy now, when you look at the various places it's in. So we know it's really good, but then how come there's a dozen or more interpretations of what it means? Well, because some things at the leading edge, we just don't know yet. We're working on it. So I would put psychic phenomena kind of in that class, where it's not being used yet. It's not accounting for a third of the world's population, but it is indirectly being used for billions of dollars a year, typically by psychics. That doesn't say it's real, but it does say it has certain pragmatic consequences. We have high confidence that it's real. There's still interpretations that we're trying to figure out to explain it. So it's true for theurgy, and it's true for divination and for enchantment.
Have you done any experiments or done any meta-analysis of papers that have done experiments on, let's talk spells and let's talk prayers, right? We'll take two kind of, people would argue, arguably say our extremes are probably pretty close to the same thing as my guess in different ways, but go ahead.
I think they're identical. It's completely identical. Prayers are typically thought of as being within the context of a religion. And the different variations of prayers, there's intercessory prayer where you're asking God to do something on your behalf. In the magical tradition, you would be creating a servitor. You create a thought form, which would do something on your behalf. Well, is that a prayer? It is kind of an intercessory prayer. You want something non-physical to intervene on your part to do something that you wish. How is that different than a religious prayer? In my sense, it's not. Spellcasting is typically that you either use your intention, I'm going to do something with my intention and I want to sort of cast it out into the world and have the world do it somehow. A lot of spellcasting does involve theurgy. It's saying I'm going to call upon this particular entity and implore or beg or ask or whatever that they do something on my behalf. So that's where we get into things like evocation. We evoke a spirit of some type and have them do something, or you invoke where they enter you and then you are
channeling.
You channel it, yeah. So yeah, and even within the laboratory, if you do an experiment on mind-matter interaction, that involves a focused intention. So that is kind of a prayer. I mean, and you ask any experimenter doing any experiment, do they do a little intentional hope that I hope this thing works? Well, yeah, it's sort of a prayer too. So it's an intentional act on the part of the experimenter. And then you hope that the participants in the experiment are also using their intention in the assigned way. But if you are able to judge who has the most intention or most focused intention in an experiment, it's the experimenter. If you're lucky. I mean, if sometimes you're really lucky, you'll get somebody who is just exceptionally good as a participant, and they'll have the same level of motivation and ability to focus and everything else. That's less likely than finding an experimenter who's really engaged in it in some way. And by the way, this is yet another confound. When you do an experiment and you get a result, who did it? This is called the source of psi problem. Where did it come from? Who's doing the thing that you're looking at in the experiment? Oftentimes very difficult to know.
Interesting. And there's probably no way to separate that, because even if you were to somehow administer it using some artificially intelligent agent, it depends on, if it's non-local, distance doesn't really matter, right? The intention could still influence the experiment. All right, I'm going to diverge a tiny bit, but you raised a question, or you raised something that I thought would be interesting to ask you about. During the course of many of these experiments, not only related to this book, but in general, have you ever had a test subject that just surprised you or blew you away in a way that, well, could have surprised you or scared you in some ways?
I don't think I've ever been scared by something that anybody did in the laboratory. I have been surprised by unexpected results in an experiment. The person who has scared me the most about all of this is myself. Typically, in doing something where an experiment worked so well that if I were not the experimenter, I would doubt the results. And other things too, like something like this. I did this in a spoon bending party. So this can't be done by force. If you bend the bowl of a soup spoon like this, the shell shape is very resistant to being bent. And so I got another spoon like this, and I measured how much torque is necessary to actually do that. And you cannot do it with your fingers, but I just did it with a pinch. So that kind of scared me, because I have no idea how that happened. But more importantly, when I was playing with this thing, looking at it, flying back home, I was on the airplane and I realized I don't know how I did this bending of metal, and I'm inside a metal thing that's 30,000 feet up, and I don't want to accidentally do whatever I did mentally and cause the wings to fall off. So it's this recognition of ignorance, essentially, that I didn't know exactly how I did this. I know what happened because I've had this now for 20 years and it hasn't changed back. And if you put it in boiling water or in the freezer or something, it doesn't change like memory metal would. So it's a real spoon. And I know I can't do it. I can't move it. So, yeah, so it's those kinds of personal experiences that I've tended to pay more attention to, because usually in the laboratory, it's set up in such a way that you are looking for a very specific kind of outcome. And you bring somebody in the lab and you want them to be psychic on demand, which is hard. And so if you're lucky, they can do it to some extent. And then you rely on lots and lots of people doing small effects and use statistics to see, well, did we get what we were hoping to find? Usually, yes, we get something. Sometimes it goes in the opposite direction. And then it's much more interesting. Because if you do it, every time you do an experiment, you get a result that you predicted, you think, well, maybe I did it. If you get a result that goes in the other direction, it means my original prediction was wrong. I'm getting something quite different. And that is much more interesting because it provides a clue as to what actually is going on. Because every experiment is a question asked of the universe. I'm asking you, does this happen? And if the answer comes back, no, it's this. Wow, that's important.
Okay, given decades of experimentation and results. So, I mean, it was not only you, but I think Duke University had I think still does, right? Not anymore?
No, that stopped in the 50s.
Okay,
1950s.
so all right, yeah, so they stopped in the 50s. Princeton had one. They had Pear until I think 2007, and then that stopped.
Something like that, yeah.
But go ahead, you were about to
Well, so
probably
the
add some
Rhine
more.
Center, when Rhine
Mhm.
retired from Duke, he went off campus. The Rhine Center still exists. So
Okay, that's
that's
why
a
I got
foundation that
confused.
continues. The Pear Lab stopped after almost 30 years because the principal retired, right? A
Mhm.
laboratory in the university depends on a person. So he retired, and the laboratory exists still in a sense that it attracted many people over the years. And they've continued that this outside of Princeton, the International Consciousness Research Laboratories. So that's still going. And this is pretty common that you'll have a laboratory that starts at a university and attracts a lot of attention, and then people continue it in some form afterwards.
So, with all this attention, with all these empirical results, why is the world still reluctant to admit that this is real?
That requires a discussion of philosophy and history, because what we're talking about is a taboo. There's a certain stigma associated with this topic. Part of it is because it is considered paranormal. Paranormal is a word that includes everything from Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and the Bermuda Triangle and UFOs and UAPs and a long list of things, which are considered entertainment. That's why it's on the X-Files, or was on the X-Files, and on every other movie that you find. Typically cast into the direction of horror. And so any scientist who wants to maintain credibility can't admit that they're interested in maybe that stuff is real, right? I mean, it's entertainment. So that taboo has persisted for a very long time. It continues to persist, I would say, largely out of ignorance. It's just simply unaware that there actually is a lot of interesting evidence going on here. It also persists because most scientists are not trained in the philosophy of science. And I know this directly because when I got out of graduate school, I didn't even know that there was a philosophy of science. I assumed that reductive materialism is really the only way, the best way, the only way of understanding the nature of the physical world. That's because I never took a course in philosophy. Nobody ever suggested it would be a good idea, except for one course as an undergraduate. We were learning things like syllogisms, which is if you have insomnia, learn about syllogisms, and you will never have insomnia ever again. It will put you to sleep in a minute. So that's part of it. It's not understanding that philosophy sits on a set of assumptions, which is philosophy of science. And also that there's a sociology of science, that science has the aspiration of being free to use the tools and techniques of science, the scientific method, to study anything that's studyable. But that's not true. There are lots and lots of constraints about what you're allowed to study. This is one of the things that, like, a naive first-year graduate student will still believe that there is academic freedom and that you can study whatever you want and so on. And by the time you finish that, or especially if you become like a junior faculty, you have learned some things you cannot study. Well, you can, but you won't remain in the academic world for very long. You'll get fired. So where did it all come from? You need to go back 500 years. You go back to the origins of science itself and the power mostly of the Catholic Church. And not only the Catholic Church, but the Protestant Reformation as well. So from a religious perspective, all of this stuff we're talking about, the magic, the theurgy, whatever, was considered to be absolutely true. It was part of the catechism. But to maintain control, social control, only certain people were allowed to do certain kinds of magic and under the auspices of the church. If you did it beyond that, you would either be killed or put into house arrest or chased out of the country by the Inquisition.
So the church actually practiced some of this stuff? I wasn't aware of that. I'm curious. I'm very curious now.
You do the Catholic Eucharist practice today, the Mass.
Yeah.
That is a magical practice. I mean, it is specifically saying that this cracker is the body of Christ. This wine it's not that it's symbolic of it,
Right. It's the principle of transubstantiation. Right?
Yeah. So
Right.
that is a very explicit magical practice. And many other things like that too, where the magic is okay within a supernatural context, which means the divine, but only by certain people in certain ways. Everything else is considered demonic. And that's very clear when you look at the history of religion, especially about the Catholic religion, and even more so after the Protestant Reformation, because the Protestant Reformation happened because of the corruption of the Catholic Church, like you could buy your way into heaven. And as one of the things that the Protestants then dropped specifically was the supernaturalism within religion. That meant all of this magical stuff that you're doing, no. They said no more. So now you have, from Catholicism, you have this push saying, oh, yeah, it's real, but only we can do it. From Protestantism, you say it's not even real. Avoid
But
it.
you have a direct connection with God.
Yeah.
That was the thing that scared, which is probably why they said, well, this stuff's not real, because if everybody has direct connection with God, everybody can do this stuff that sometimes might be dangerous.
Yeah.
Right.
You don't need all the rigmarole and the rest of it. And the presumption was, the hope was that the corruption would go away because now it was more of a personal relationship. Nevertheless, you had a strong religious push. At the same time that much of this was happening, there was the development of science. So we're talking about Galileo and Newton and those folks. They knew that if they challenged the church's authority, they would either be killed, and some of them were, or they'd be in house arrest, or they simply would be persona non grata and not be able to do anything anymore. And so science took the point of view of everything about the physical world is okay to study, objective, measurable things. That's the beginning of materialism as a doctrine. Everything about the internal world, which they called the spirit world, the human spirit, that's taken care of by the church. And we're not going to cross those bounds. And the church agreed, you can take care of the objective physical world, but do not touch the internal spiritual world. That has echoed down for over 500 years. And so people who are doing science and also scholarship today, they can study what happened in religion, and they can study the history, and they can do this and that. You cannot say that these phenomena are real, because the phenomena we're talking about are an overlap between objective and subjective. It's like it's this space that a boundary that you're not supposed to cross. And yet these phenomena say, whether we're told about it or not, they do cross. They're related to each other in some way. So up until recently, if you were an anthropologist studying people living out in the bush somewhere who are basically believed in shamanism, you could study it and describe it in great gory detail. And the secret of that, though, that they don't talk about is that if you're an anthropologist and you spend enough time with people, indigenous peoples and their practices,
you go native. Right.
You completely go native, and you know that it's true because now your experience is telling you, yeah, I can talk to the animals and they talk back.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't write that down. So recently, all of this, now there's a change happening in lots of different fields. It's happening because of a confluence of two things. It's quanta and qualia. So these two words, quanta is some of the strangeness of quantum mechanics, which is saying that if like the quantum observer effect, if you look at a physical system, it changes its behavior. That's completely new. The way that I put this in the latest book that I wrote, which is not out yet, is that it creates a strange sort of intermixing between epistemology and ontology.
Mm-hmm.
So what that means is epistemology is how do you know something? It's like the method of science. We know things. Well, we measure it and so on. It's ways of knowing. And ontology is how the thing actually is. It's the isness of something. It's the existence of something. Well, classical physics and most of everyday experience says that how you know something and the thing itself are different. Like the thing itself, that is simply the way that it is. The moon's there. We assume it's there. It's always there. It's there whether you look at it or not, and so on. The epistemology then has said, well, how would we know that? Well, we use a telescope and we use methods of measuring and so on. This assumption has broken down because of quantum mechanics, that we know that if you observe something, its behavior changes. And it's even more subtle than that. The properties of the thing changes, which suggests that the properties of an unobserved thing are not properties anymore. There's a something there, but we have no words to describe it because it has no properties, which is really bizarre. We don't have words to describe something that doesn't have properties. But nevertheless, that's what the evidence says. And so that opens the door a crack into the realm that we're talking about, because now we're saying, well, there's something about the nature of observation which is changing the world as we see it. It's a blurring between epistemological, the method of observing, and ontology, the thing that you're observing. They're mixed. So the other part is qualia. Qualia is talking about internal experience, the feeling of what it is like to be something. So the qualia is you bite into a lemon and you have a particular experience of that taste. Well, if you look from the outside in, you look at all of the neural mechanisms going on when you take a bite of this, you can trace it all the way down to individual neurons and even below. That doesn't tell you anything about what a lemon tastes like. So this is called the hard problem in consciousness studies, where we see neural correlates. There are correlations between your experience and what's happening in the brain, but that doesn't mean it's causal. So what's causing what? We don't know. That's the mystery of qualia. And it turns out that qualia and quanta are two sides of the same coin. They both have something to do with observation, information, consciousness, and the physical world. So that's what I'm saying then, that what we're talking about here really is about the boundary between consciousness, subjectivity, first-person experience, and the nature of the physical world. They are not separate. They merge or blur in some way. And the place where they blur is magic, shamanism, some aspects of religion, mysticism. That's where it is. It's right smack in the middle. That's why I'm so interested in it. I mean, what a mystery. It's like it's here all the time. It's like vibrantly alive between our experience and the world itself. And that's where magic is.
Okay, now I think prior to the call, we talked about a personal experience I have. Some people in my audience have heard it, some haven't. So I'm going to go through it very quickly so I minimize the time I'm talking, maximize the time you're talking. Okay. So, all right, about a year ago, roughly around this, same time, sometime in September, there was an owl that landed on my back fence, and I just kind of I was so amazed by it because it's a great horned owl. That's not something that happens often. I kind of just mentally projected, please stay there. I'd really like to get some pictures because this doesn't, whatever. And of course, I was alone at home. Nobody was around. So I got my camera, got everything ready, and I went out, still there. I got within 5 feet, took 1,000 photos of the guy, took some video, all that stuff, called my parents, showed them on the cell phone, etc. It was just kind of a weird, unusual experience, but I kind of just filed it away. And then I don't know why I tried this, but one day I just thought, well, let's see if I can summon a raven. Why not? So I sat down. I've read about remote viewing. I've read about the process, the procedure. I've never been formally trained, so I can't claim to be a remote viewer, but I adapted some of the processes of just kind of not quieting your mind, but you should, but some of the visualizations and things like that. So I imagined that, kind of a local raven somewhere, and then thought of its location, and then kind of projected a path to my house from a literal bird's eye view to just see if I could get a raven to come to my house. So I kind of sat down, kind of did that 5-10 minutes. And within 20 minutes, I hear a squawking behind me. And I look behind me, and right on kind of the tree bordering onto my property was a raven. Okay. Could have easily been chance. I tried it again a few days or weeks later, no effect. Okay. So 1 for 2 on ravens. A few months later, this is kind of a longer story. I feel I've been working a lot recently and I haven't really been able to go out and hike, but I feel this intense desire that I need to go to the park tonight. So I went out around dusk, was walking around, and then sort of when it got extremely dark, I'm like, okay, it's time to go back. On the way back, on the path, I look up and there's an owl just sitting there looking down at me. And I go home 2 days later. I'm like, you know what? Maybe I could try to do that with an owl. So I do the same thing. Okay. Faster than you can order a pizza. I hear all this commotion with the birds, right? And if you've ever been around owls, right, or any sort of bird predator, right, they get crazy. So I look up and there on the fence is an owl. And one for one, the only time I tried it. So I'm so amazed, it eventually flies away. I call a friend. I'm talking to my friend. The owl returns. I see kind of the wings, and as the instant it sets up, like lands on a redwood tree in the adjacent property, looking directly in my direction. Like I'm literally sitting down looking that direction. The phone call cuts out, and the owl looks down at me, hoots 3 times. And then, of course, I'm dumbfounded. I scramble for my phone, try to get the camera out. And I have this picture of the owl flying away. Okay. So, a week or so, maybe 2 weeks later, I go outside to try to record this phenomena. And I'm fumbling with the cameras. I'm dealing with it. And this time I want to do it with a hawk. I want to, kind of summon a hawk. As I'm trying to set things up, I hear this, hawks sound like an eagle because that's not what an eagle really sounds like. It just Hollywood use red-tailed hawks to record it. So I hear this screeching, right? But I didn't sit down and I didn't do any of this stuff yet. So I'm like, oh, maybe it'll be easy this time. Maybe there's one in the area. I sit down, fail. I'm a 0 for 1 with hawks. So, I was trying to record it on video to see, to actually document.
But you did hear it.
Before I went through the procedure.
I see. Okay.
Okay. So stepping all the way back, there's 5 things, in my opinion, this could be. Number 1, random chance. Okay. Number 2, it could be some sort of communication, right? Psi communication, whatever you want to call it. Number 3, it could be some sort of shamanic initiation, right? If you look at the literature, whatever that entails. Mm-hmm. Number 4, it could be some sort of precognitive, like precognition. I just happen to go and do this when there's going to be something in the area. Or number 4, it's some sort of, and this is related to the shamanic thing, it could be some sort of communication with a non-human something. I don't know what it is. And by the way, incidentally, the day after I tried this with the hawks, right, I think there were literally, I've never seen this many hawks at once, but 9 hawks flew over my house. We're kind of circling. I've never seen that before. So, pretty high up. But with you as an experimentalist, how can I, design an experiment that has some rigor, but again, we're dealing with somebody doing something personally. And number 2, would help me elicit which one of those effects it really is. Being fully cognizant, it could be completely random chance.
Yeah. The same issue comes up in any kind of experiment. Anything could be chance. So the way you deal with it from an experimental point of view is you keep a very good log of what's happened. I did this. This is what happened. The more methods that you have of keeping objective measures, like photographs and stuff, the better. And so you might set out in advance to say, I'm going to do this 100 times. I'm going to not do it more than maybe once or twice a week so I don't get burnt out on it, but do it 100 times, and that will be the experiment. And we'll do it in a way so that, as I said, that you do maybe once a week, or maybe even match it to time of year or something, location. Once you have that, it's not a controlled experiment because there are aspects of this you can't control.
Right.
But but you will have a much better notion of what the hit rate is. And then you may want to have a control period. So you set aside days where I'm not doing it today, but at the same time that I would normally do it, I'm taking pictures, I'm listening, whatever. So days that you're doing it, days that you're not doing it, and then you have a way of comparing. It'll be a little bit tricky on days you're not doing it because you may need somebody else to actually do it. Because if you, especially after you do it 100 times, you may unconsciously be doing it. So you may want to assign.
You need a control. Yeah, you need a control for you, right?
Yes.
Not just
you want a third party who could just simply do what you ask them to do without even saying what they're supposed to be doing, right? It's not that I simply want a bird to show up, but I wanted them to show up in a particular place at a particular time. And you'll have some leeway on it because maybe they don't show up on the right tree because they don't like that tree for some reason, but some way of scoping out what matters, what counts as a hit. And then you have somebody else do a recording on off days, same location, same constraints, and then you have a way of comparing. So that's a viable, I would say, like a field experiment. It's perfectly valid, but it would require more logging and a control in order to have something to compare it against.
Okay, so that would kind of get you something that would suggest that whatever I'm doing, it's working. What could you do to tease out whether it's, so that would distinguish between option one, which is pure chance, and something else. How do you tease out what the something else is?
Yeah. In this particular case, because it's not really controlled, it would be very difficult. When your description of it made me think, though, that if a bird comes by and is making sounds at you and then goes away, if from a shamanistic perspective, you're calling that thing, you're calling the entity, you're calling the bird. And once they show up, well, they're asking, well, what? I'm just flying around here and I get your message. Okay, I'm here. What do you want me to do?
Well, that was before the message. Like the hawk was before. It was flying around before I sat down.
I know.
Just as soon as I went outside. Okay.
But all of the examples that you're saying, that when you intentionally say, I would like this bird to show up now, in the wild, if you are actually a shaman and doing this stuff, you're not going to just randomly call them simply because you want to say hello. You want to have something, you want to doing it for a reason, because they're doing some kind of business and they're getting deflected from whatever that was. Then they show up and they start squawking at you. They're saying, well, what do you want me to do? Well, so you may want to build into the protocol something where there's some activity, there's some reason for this. Who knows? Maybe the bird would say, oh, that's a good experiment, but at least give it a reason, because it has a job to do. It wants to know why am I going here?
Yeah, the owl definitely had that energy, where it kind of showed up and then it kind of left and then it came back. It's just like, what?
Yeah, like what? What you heard was who, but he actually was what? Yeah, what?
So what would you recommend for something like that? The problem is in this experiment. So I left some like pork out on the fence just to eat later, which I don't think it actually came back and did. But the problem is if I did that every time, it's going to attract all sorts of birds and it'll screw up the experiment.
No,
what do you recommend I do to kind of like not have that confounding effect?
You might just simply have it as something like, how you doing? You doing okay? Good. You need any help? You need something? Because then it's not a physical offer, because you're right. You put food out there, you're going to attract everything in the world. And they'll also learn that whenever this guy is around, they need to come because they can see you 2 miles away. But something more along the lines of, hello, you doing okay? Everything good? It's simply an acknowledgement of, thank you for dropping by. As you know, I'm doing an experiment and I appreciate your deflection from your day. Just something maybe that simple. Because as we find even as humans, that simply acknowledging you see the other person, that's powerful all by itself, the acknowledgement of the other person. So maybe it's true for a bird too, especially those kinds of birds are really intelligent. So Yeah. So my bird story, I have two bird stories. One was when I was a kid, we went to a World's Fair in Montreal. This was way back when. And so we were driving through the state of Maine, which is mostly forest. And I was in the passenger side on the back seat on the right side. So I'm watching the road as it goes by. And I think I see a bird sitting on the railing of the highway, really far away in the distance. And it's coming towards us, and the bird is getting bigger and bigger. And I realized this is a huge bird. So we passed the bird, and it's, I'm guessing, 6 feet, maybe, while sitting, a gigantic bird who watched me as we went by. You know, I was kind of watching him, and he was watching me, and he turned his head as we went by. So I asked my brother sitting next to me, my parents were in the front, did you see that? None of them did. So as it turns out, the place that we were driving through was part of an Indian reservation where the Thunderbird was part of the lore there. The Thunderbird was a messenger from the Great Spirit. So that was, again, from a shamanistic perspective, kind of a, I don't know, an initiation or something similar to what you were saying. So that was the Thunderbird. And the impact of it was that it's the sort of memory that doesn't go away. It was there. I don't know what it means, but I remember very clearly that that bird was looking at me and nobody else saw it. So the other one is more recent. I've finished a second book on magic, and I was writing about how certain animals become familiars, in particular ravens. So I wrote this passage, and then my wife and I went out to walk the dog, and we went past the neighbor's house, and we heard this strange knocking sound, almost like a woodpecker, but slower, more like a woodblock that you would hear in an orchestra. Knock, 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 pause, knock, knock, knock. So I looked up, 2 ravens sitting on the roof of our neighbor's house, looking at me, as best as I can tell that a bird is looking at me. And they do the knock, knock, knock a couple of times. And so your experience reminded me of that, because I had the sense at the time that they really were there because I asked them to be there. But I didn't know that they were going to do that. And ravens don't show up here very often. Occasionally, like rarely, we'll see an owl, but it's suburbia. We don't see those kinds of animals very much. So was that a coincidence? See, it's the same problem. I recorded it. I remembered it because it was in close proximity to my writing about ravens, and then they are. So yeah, I think these kinds of coincidences probably happen far more often than we think. We just either...
Yeah, speaking of raven stories, I've had a raven where I have my bedroom. We have like a little tiny balcony, like 5 feet away from the bed. And there was a time when I had a book of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories. And one day I was just kind of laying down, and I look up, and there's a raven sitting on the railing squawking at me. And I look down, and there's Edgar Allan Poe's book. It's just like, yeah, it's just like, you can't make this. It's just like one of those synchronicities. You're like, I don't even know how to, but I mean, like 5 feet away and squawking at me. So. Yeah.
And so internally though, do you saying is the raven simply saying, what? Why am I here? Why are you calling me? Or that's what ravens do, right? They call. One thing I did mention about the raven is I was looking through a copy of the New Yorker magazine, and I saw a cartoon about a raven. It's about the Edgar Allan Poe's Raven. And I think, oh, that's a good coincidence, because that was the same day that I also wrote this paragraph about ravens in my book. So I had 2 raven episodes. One is a cartoon, which of course it was unexpected. I didn't know that was going to show up. And then the actual ravens. So, right, what do we do with these experiences? So these are filed into strange things that happen, which might be coincidence. But from a historical perspective, and especially from a shamanistic one, it's not quite as coincidental as you might think.
All right, Dr. Radin, any final words for the audience?
Nevermore.
Quote the raven.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Radin. I very much appreciate it.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.